Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demos. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. This is part 2 of my conversation with Christian apologist Greg Koukl. If you haven't listened to part 1, make certain you check out the link in the description, and I hope you enjoy this great conversation. So, moving back into your story, because I know like part 3 is about Jesus, part 5 is the resurrection.
Right.
When we're looking into that, I think I guess I should ask this question: when we look at Jesus, and particularly now when we're looking at him as far as kind of the influence we have, has there been some confusion between the historical Jesus that you almost write about in point 3 and the resurrected Jesus, where we're focusing too much on how Jesus acted when he was here versus where he is now, or where he came when after he was risen? Is there a difference between the two, and should we focus on them differently?
Well, there is a difference certainly between the two. He's glorified now. He's not in his submission to the Father in the sense that, his kenosis, they call it, or his emptying. Philippians chapter 2, he didn't regard equality with God a thing to be held on to. But that it's Jesus' earthly life that the scripture points to as the model we should follow. In fact, in that verse, it says, have this attitude in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus, who did not regard equality with God as a thing to be, but humbled himself to become a servant, even to the point of death. So I think most of my opinion in your question, most of our reflection should be on Jesus' earthly habit, pattern, example, that we are to be like him. And even after the resurrection, this is what Paul in Philippians 2 was telling us to think about. Think about Jesus in his earthly life, okay? Now, the glorified Jesus, that's kind of at the end. That's to come. And the glorified Jesus is kind of a type, if you will, or archetype of our glorified selves when we are resurrected like him. And 1 Corinthians 15 talks more detail about that. So I'm just saying, I don't think so much about Jesus in his glorified state. Stephen got a picture of that a little bit, but that's when he's dying, we see Jesus, he's being executed there in the book of Acts. But for the most part, I think we're supposed to look upon Jesus in the life that he lived. And that's what, if I understand that 2 Corinthians chapter 4 reference there, that transforms us from glory to glory. We gaze upon him. Now, I don't think that's an easy thing to do, frankly, but the more we meditate on that, we think about how Jesus acted, and we let Jesus' behavior in his earthly ministry inform our behavior in our earthly ministry, the more that transformation takes place. But it's a long haul. There is no quick fixes in Christianity. There are exceptions to that. Sometimes the Spirit right in, bada boom, but normally that isn't the way God works.
So when I look at Jesus, I look at his life, it could be complex and how we're supposed to be doing it. I mean, I could just think of when he was talking to people, the woman of the well, he handled differently than the woman he called a dog, versus him, with the centurion, where he was like, with one, he said, "Oh, I'm not going to give what's holy to dogs." And the centurion, he's like, "Oh, you just have great faith. Here we go." It seems like in all these circumstances Jesus had, it was a different context, but how to apply that context to our lives seems confusing.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people on that there?
Yeah, what you see in all these examples is Jesus responding to the circumstances he was faced with. So in Paul says that in Colossians 4 that we should make the most of every opportunity and and be sensitive to the individual, essentially. Conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt, so you know how to respond to each person. That's the part I was after. You know how to respond to each person. And you see that in Jesus, responding uniquely to each person. But I do want to say something about the Syrophoenician woman that you cited. He seemed to call her a dog. I'm convinced that Jesus wasn't doing that. What he was doing was he was reflecting the theology of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious leadership. Because it's interesting, he says, well, she's a Gentile, right? And her daughter is demon possessed. And he says, well, it's not good to throw the children's bread to dogs. Now, dogs is what a term that was used by the Jews to describe Gentiles, you know. Now, if he really believed that, what he did in a few moments later would have been bad, because he ended up healing that girl. And so then he would have been doing something he just said wasn't good.
Oh,
Jesus was reflecting the theology. That wasn't his theology. And we see this in a number of cases where Jesus is championing the Gentile, or even the half Gentile, which is the Samaritan woman. When he gives that famous statement there in the synagogue in Capernaum, and he says, today this has been fulfilled, this prophecy has been fulfilled in your hearing. People were saying nice things about him until he cited the Old Testament where Naaman the Gentile, you know, and also the widow, these were Gentiles, and then they got furious. So that was their theology, not Jesus. So Jesus is saying this thing to her. Now, this is interpretive, but it fits perfectly. That was, well, that's the theology of the Jews. And then she says, well, even the dogs eat the crumbs under the table. In other words, what the children have thrown away, which is actually what was going on. A lot of these guys are rejecting Jesus. And so he says, okay, got it. And, okay, I'm going to heal your daughter. He responds to her, you know, properly as a Gentile, and in a way that's not consistent with the reigning theology, which he disagreed with. So, but notice there, just like we were talking about, in each circumstance, you have a different circumstance. You have different people, you have different issues. And this is a very important thing when we're engaging people. If we have a cookie cutter approach, we use the same thing with every person. God's going to use that on occasion, but it isn't the way Jesus acted. He engaged the individual where they're at. And this is one thing that I think that makes the tactical game plan from that other book, the tactics book, so effective, because it allows you to be very, very flexible to the circumstances, just like Jesus was.
I would imagine that the biggest obstacle or objection you get deals with the problem of evil, or the problem of morality. Which one do they seem to throw up more now?
What was the second one? The problem of morality?
With morality, like you know, of defining what morality is. Because as soon as you say there is truth, as soon as you say there is a reality, then now all morality has to come from this truth that's there.
That's right.
And now it's objective. So it seems like there would be the two objections that I seem to deal with when I talk with people on a regular basis, and nowhere near what you experience, seems to kind of fall in those areas: evil, bad things, or, you know, how do you really know what's moral or not? Are you seeing a trend one direction or another?
Yeah, well, certainly the problem of evil is a perennial challenge to Christianity. And what's really interesting about the juxtaposition of those two issues is, if a person is complaining about the problem of evil and asking the Christian about that in light of his Christian convictions, they have already acknowledged an objective moral code that is being violated in order to have evil in the world, which they're complaining about. So the notion of complain about the problem of evil entails the reality of objective moral truth. Now, maybe we got to, you know, parse it out. What are all those objective moral truths? But we know some of them that are been violent, and people bring it up. You know, murder, rape, you know, genocide, ethnic cleansing, or, you know, right on down the line. So At least those are items that they believe are objective moral harms. And that's why they're asking, how could a good, powerful God allow objective moral harms in the world? Okay. So those two things are tied together. And if person is raising the problem of evil, they are already affirming objective morality. Now, if they don't want to affirm, no, there's no morality. No, that's just a matter of your own personal opinion. That's moral relativism. Well, then there's no problem of evil. There are just things that happen that you don't like. And
Right.
why should anybody care what you like if there's no obligation, objective obligation, to care about what people like? Okay. So this is really key. Now, one other thing about the problem of evil, and I unpack this in a very deliberate way in another book that I wrote called Street Smarts. And the title of the chapter is Evil, Atheism's Fatal Flaw.
Hmm.
You see, evil is not the problem for Christian theism that people think it is. It affirms Christian theism. Now, we have to make sense of the challenge, good God, powerful God, evil. How's that work? But it fits in our worldview. In fact, our entire story is about the problem of evil. It starts in chapter 3 and doesn't end for 66 books. If there were no problem of evil, we'd have no story. All right. So the whole story is telling about how God deals with the problem of evil. But the problem is, and I talk to atheists and I say, let's just say you're right. There is no God. You're right. But those things that you were just describing, do they still happen? The rapes, the murders, tortures, all that. Of course they do. Are those things still evil? Yes, of course they are. That's why I don't believe in God. Okay, now you explain to me from the position of an atheist worldview, molecules clashing in the universe, that's it, molecules in motion, how any of those things could be objectively evil. You see, the problem of evil is not a Christian problem, it's a human problem. And every worldview has to address that human problem. And we have a way of addressing it. We take it seriously. The only avenue for an atheist is to say there is no problem of evil because it makes no sense in a materialistic worldview, naturalistic worldview of atheism. And of course, that's so wildly counterintuitive. They're the ones who have the problem of evil. You can't complain about evil if there is no
Right.
God. There's got to be a standard. Anyway, so that was a thumbnail sketch of it. Maybe it went over some people's heads, but get the book Street Smarts and you can see the whole enchilada there. So, but it's a very curious kind of relationship between the complaint and evidence for God. I think evil is one of the best evidences for God. That is classically called the moral argument for the existence of God, but that's how that works together in my view.
All right. So I want to kind of wrap this up here.
Now we're having so much fun. We're running out of time.
Well, so again, I read Story of Reality, read Tactics of the by the way, the 100 verses that point to Jesus is the only way is awesome too. By the way, it's really
That
really
little
good.
booklet, yeah.
Yeah, but it's great because it's just because dealing with Jesus is the only way is one of those other kind of things that people seem to feel like there's an arrogance about, and then all of a sudden when you start looking at all the verses, not just that one thing that Jesus said, it's like, oh, this is like so voluminous that you have to believe it at this point.
Right. It was built into the warp and woof of Jesus' entire ministry that he's the only way of salvation. There's 9 lines of argument the New Testament offers based on those verses. Yeah, that's great.
So when people have doubts about this and they're struggling, I think it's common for most Christians to struggle, to have doubts, whether it's as simple as maybe I should have prayed differently and that's the reason why I have this outcome that I got, or I have doubts that this is even real. Because I mean, honestly, sometimes I read like especially the Old Testament and I'm like, oh, this is hard. This is really hard to imagine. When you have those doubts, what advice do you give people on that? Because I agree, every part of the 5 parts that you have in the story of reality is 100% accurate, is 100% true. But at the same time, when I'm at those 2 a.m. moments when I'm waking up and I'm kind of wondering, or I'm struggling with again the readings that I'm reading at that day, what advice do you give them on how to help overcome these doubts?
Yeah, this is a very good question. It's very practical. The Old Testament has a lot of stuff that's hard to figure out, because it happened thousands of years ago in a different part of the world, in a totally different cultural circumstance. And so some of those things have to be understood in light of all of that. But and I talk about that in Street Smarts. I talk about a lot of those problems in the Old Testament. But to speak to that, I will just say this. Jesus believed the entire Old Testament was God inspired. Okay. And you could tell this by the statements that he makes.
Right.
So if we have good reason to trust Jesus as the one he claimed to be, God incarnate, et cetera, then his assessment of the Old Testament is accurate. Now, we may not know how that all works out, but Jesus does. And so that can carry us over for the moment until we work out the details for ourselves. So we're going to be confident in these things we don't understand about the Old Testament because Jesus was confident about it and thought it was appropriate, whatever. The other thing about the just generalized doubt. Here's a good question for people to ask when they're wake up at two in the morning and they're wondering, gee, what's the story with all of this stuff? Here's the question they should ask themselves. What is the alternative? Right?
I love that question.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah. So, okay, maybe God doesn't exist. Well, if God doesn't exist, okay, all bets are off. There is no meaning, there is no value, there is no morality, there is no explanation for the beginning of the universe or of consciousness or anything. I mean, this is a totally dead end. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, I think is the way Richard Dawkins put it. That's it. And if that's the way you think the world actually is, well, that fits a materialistic, atheistic worldview. Now, maybe, okay, then you have to go from there. And there is no worldview that anybody is going to adopt that doesn't have all kinds of loose ends. And it's because our knowledge and understanding are limited, okay? And we do the best we can if we're being careful. Even so, we're still going to have unanswered questions. And that's okay. What I've found with Christianity, it's one of the purposes I wrote The Story of Reality, is that there is nothing else that comes even close to giving a coherent view of reality that fits what we know about the universe and also our deepest intuitions about the way the world is, like in the problem of evil, It's so obvious. Well, that fits in our worldview. And so it is the coherence and the applicability of all the truth of Christianity to the world as we know it, reality, that is one of the strongest apologetics or defenses for the Christian worldview that I know of. Here's the simplest way that I know to put it. My daughter, when she was 6 years old, said, "Why do we believe God is true?" And I thought about it for a moment. And then I said, "Honey, the reason we believe God is true is because he's the best explanation for the way things are. He's the best explanation for the way things are. Nothing else comes close."
So I got to ask this follow-up now because it almost seems by you asking that question or encouraging people to ask that question, there almost seems to be a level of deconstruction at that point in time, which we know is not necessarily, the deconstruction movement, the progressive movement, et cetera. But by starting to ask that question of, what is the alternative? Maybe I should start questioning this. Or are you almost advocating the deconstruction of these other theories that could possibly be out there because this is the best? How does that play into that?
Well, yeah, deconstruction has a lot of different elements to it, and I prefer to just think about it as just doing an assessment. That's it. If either doubting of Christianity, okay, then it's time for an assessment. Now, I'm comfortable with saying that because I am convinced that Christianity can stand up to the assessment. It can stand up to the questions. The answers are out there. Maybe people don't have them at the moment. str.org, that's a place to start. And there's lots of other material. But listen, this, Peter, we have a very deep bench. There isn't an issue that's been brought up against God and the Bible and Jesus, et cetera, that has not been done. Some really smart person on our side, our team, has done a deep dive into and come up with really good answers. So it's a matter of availing yourselves to those answers. But I will tell you what's available on the other side. And this is really important. That's why I say, what's the alternative? Because there's nothing but it's an abyss on the other side. It's what are you going to go to? You can adopt some other religious view. They're not going to give you any reason why you should believe that. Go Buddhism, Hinduism, all kinds of other options. Okay. Oh, I like that. It doesn't matter what you like. What matters is what's real, right?
Right.
So they're not going to give you any good reasons. And if you want to go the atheism bit, I'm telling you, that is nothingism. Now, here's the 2-bit word, nihilism. Nihilism. That's the philosophical word. It means nothingism. There's nothing there. And a lot of people believe atheism, but that means there's nothing. All it is molecules in motion. No morality, no good, no evil, just pitiless indifference. And that does not resonate with my take of the universe. We have an intuitive sense that human beings are special and are made for something greater. Okay. Watch Hollywood. What do they call it? They call it the human spirit, right? What is it? Well, they're onto something there, right? They're not giving credit to God and his worldview, but they're onto something real. That makes no sense in an atheistic worldview, but it makes sense in our worldview. So that's my encouragement to people.
That's awesome. Well, I greatly appreciate you. I greatly appreciate your conversation. So if somebody wants to order your books, I know you can get them on Amazon, but if they want to know more about the research that's there, to listen to your podcast, to find out all this information, where do they go? How do they find out about all this?
All right, 2 things for the books. Don't tell my staff that I said this, but just go to Amazon and type in Koukl. That's how my name is spelled. If you look for the titles, you're going to get a whole bunch of things that are unrelated. If you get the tactics, you're going to get military stuff. So, and you're going to just Koukl and you get all the books. All right. You can also get them at our website, which is STR, stand to reason, str.org. And it is a really, really good website. We have gazillions of things, training programs, podcasts, videos, articles. And we have a good search feature too. You just search on some issue. We've spoken almost 32 years now. May 1st, be 32 years. We've got a lot of stuff there. So I recommend str.org. And grab some of the books. And if you want to build a foundation, get Story of Reality. Even if you're a believer, it'll help you to understand the big picture. If you want to know how to engage, get the book Tactics. And the follow-up to Tactics is called Street Smarts. So there you go.
All right, sounds good. And your podcast can be found on Apple Podcast.
Sure, all around. I don't know how that works, but people who know how that works know how it works. My 17-year-old knows all that stuff. But but you can also subscribe right from our website at str.org.
Well, Greg, thank you again so much. I greatly appreciate you, all you've done for my family, and you just continue doing that work. So thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. I'm so happy to have been useful in your family, especially. That's great. Thanks.